Hello, and welcome to Leeds Echoes. In this series, I'll be exploring different aspects of Leeds' rich history. Each episode, I'll tell a different story, whether it's a particular building, an entire industry, a lost transportation network. But most importantly, I want to try and figure out how the people that lived and breathed this history felt. What did the local butcher think? Or your neighbour? What did the city sound like? And what did it smell like? These are the kind of things I really want to explore in this series, and I'm really excited where the journey's going to take me. Hopefully I'll see some of you on the way. South of the River Aire in Leeds, sitting immediately under the city centre, is a network of old communities that holds the true secret of Leeds. They are the very reason the city exists as it does today. This area was Leeds' workshop, and in turn, once the country's workshop. The now often neglected streets displaying the raw layers of Leeds' rich industrial past. And within these crumbling ruins, these forgotten streets, there lies a building which defies belief. So ridiculous, so unusual, so grand, it could only be in the heart of West Yorkshire that you could find a former flax mill, meticulously modelled to look like an Egyptian temple. Yes, it's time to talk about temple works. Built in 1836 by Leeds industrialist John Marshall, it was one of several mills he owned, and it employed over 2,500 people. The main office building's facade consists of 18 two-storey high stone pillars and is based on the Temple of Horus at Edfu. The huge main factory building is derived from the Typhonium at Dendera. It truly is a sight to behold, an Egyptian temple in the middle of Holbeck. And at its heart was an enormous room, measuring 396 feet long and 216 wide. It covered nearly 2 acres of ground, and it was at the time the largest room on Earth. It was lit by 67 large conical skylights, which flooded the room with as much natural light as possible. To keep the room at a stable and humid temperature and allow the flax to be at its most workable, the roof was covered in earth, and then grass was planted. Let me remind you that this is 1836. To solve the issue of maintaining the grass, a small flock of sheep were kept on the roof, obviously. To solve the problem of getting the sheep on the roof, well, they had Benjamin Hick, a civil and mechanical engineer, develop what may have been the world's first hydraulic lift, to lift sheep onto a garden roof of the world's largest room in 1836. If all this sounds ridiculous and incredible, it's because it was. But this wasn't just any old city. This was Leeds. Rewind back to the 1700s, and Leeds was standing out in the world in a way that today I'm really quite proud of. The city was pushing back on religion and promoting science. John Marshall's father had started life as a Baptist, but by the time his son was born, he'd become a Unitarian, attending the infamous Mill Hill Chapel, which still exists today opposite the Queen's Hotel on City Square, which, for much of John's early life, was dominated by the even more infamous Joseph Priestley. Now, I'm a big Priestley fanboy, and there will likely be a future episode dedicated to him, but just to give you a brief overview, Priestley was a theologian and a scientist. He strongly believed in the free and open exchange of ideas. He advocated toleration and equal rights for religious dissenters. Oh, and amongst many other things, he was the first to identify oxygen, and he invented carbonated water, because that didn't go on to change everyone's lives forever. And when you think about a young John Marshall being exposed to these ideas and philosophies, listening to Priestley's sermons, temple work starts to make a lot more sense. This was an incredibly revolutionary time, and Leeds was literally right in the middle of it. By the time his father Jeremiah had died in 1787 and John took control of the family linen business, the Leeds-Liverpool Canal had opened, connecting inland Leeds directly west to the UK's largest and busiest port outside of London, Liverpool. The Aire and Calder canals link Leeds to the east coast and to Hull's huge port too, so goods and services and ideas could flow easily from everywhere straight into Leeds. What was still then just a town in the heart of West Yorkshire was now connected to the entire world. I feel now might be a useful time to clarify our natural textiles. Linen is made from plant fibre, or flax. Today we mainly use it for bed sheets, but during the 18th century it was used extensively, particularly for garments that touched the body. And the Marshalls were linen people. John's father, Jeremiah, was a linen draper, and John then went on to be a producer of linen itself, running these flax mills which processed the raw flax into finished linen. Leeds was host to a wealth of different textile industries. Wool was the fibre of choice of some of Leeds' other surviving mills like Armley, Burley and St Anne's. And since his father's death, John had been gradually building this empire of flax mills. He constructed Marshall's Mill between 1791 and 92, which is the 6-storey behemoth which still stands next door to where he'd later construct Temple Works. And it was here at Marshall's Mills that he made his crucial shift from water power to steam engine. Interesting to note here that Holbeck is called such because it is the whole beck, the beck being a Yorkshire colloquial term for a stream, and the whole beck was used as a power source for much of its early industrialisation. So John made clever partnerships with various engineers and businessmen to further fund his ambition after his switch to steam. He grew wealthy and powerful, and he left the day-to-day running of the business to his son and turned his attention to social issues. He was a keen proponent of education, establishing one of the earliest schools in Holbeck. He was involved in the founding of the Mechanics' Institute and Literary and Philosophical Society in Leeds, essentially laying the groundwork for the universities. He was a regular contributor to the Leeds Library, of which Joseph Priestley was a founding member. Eventually he became an MP, although this was fairly short-lived due to ill health, which saw him retire to his country residence in the Lake District. The construction of Temple Mills was his last great hurrah, and you may be wondering what was behind the mill's wildly unique Egyptian style. Now, it may well have been that John had long held an interest in Egyptology. However, there was a definite and obvious event that clearly inspired him. The Leeds Philosophical Society, which he was closely associated with, had just recovered an Egyptian mummy, Nessi-Amun. Now, Nessi-Amun was a priest in the Temple of Amun in Karnak, which, no surprise, was in Thebes, as were both the temples which John modelled Temple Mills after. Wonderfully, Nessi-Amun is still on display in Leeds today at the City Museum, having even survived a bombing raid by the Luftwaffe in the Second World War, which sadly destroyed Leeds' other 2 mummies. And so it came to be that an Egyptian priest inspired a Leeds industrialist to create a vision of both past and future simultaneously. Whilst conditions for workers in the mill were undoubtedly unbearable by today's standards, John was seen as a radically progressive and liberal employer. Despite the 72-hour working weeks, that 20% of his workforce were under 13, the relentlessly hot and humid conditions, he did actively discourage corporal punishment of workers, which was pretty groundbreaking. He also provided facilities to help accommodate working mothers with young children, and he regularly encouraged those children into education. When you step back from all the grandeur, however, all the sentiment and good intention, Temple Mills was essentially a white elephant. In the 40 years it was run by the Marshalls, it made a loss in 21 of them. The third generation of Marshalls who inherited the business were said to utterly despise it. But this relatively short-lived and financially unstable business left an immeasurable mark on the Leeds landscape. I mean, even the street it's on got called Marshall Street. And from here, the history gets a little patchy. James Rhodes & Co., a clothing manufacturer, took over the site in 1886 after the Marshalls relocated their company to America. James Rhodes was there until at least 1936, where I found a beautifully handwritten receipt, the top of the paper adorned by an illustration of Temple Works in all its glory, smoke billowing from the chimney. It then shows up on a 1950s ordnance survey labelled as a warehouse, yet nearly always also being labelled specifically as Temple Works, an honour I've rarely seen bestowed on a building. From the early 50s onwards, it was occupied by the once household name of Kay's Mail Order Catalogue Company. And they were there right up until 2004. Kay's finally collapsed, and the secretive and insanely rich Barclay family inherited the property as part of their purchase of Kay's and the other failed catalogue company Littlewoods. From 2004, it was used as a local cultural hub. However, the building was neglected. The restoration costs were put to upwards of £20 million, and no one seemed to want to step up to the plate. The building was at serious risk of collapsing in on itself, doomed by its own grandeur. On the 8th of December 2009, a stone pillar in the mill's facade collapsed, and many thought the building would soon be gone, which would have been a travesty. This is a Grade 1 listed building in Holbeck. This is important. After a few failed attempts, including by Burberry, of salvaging the building, it eventually ended up being put up for auction by the Barclays for just £1. A huge outrage rightly erupted, many people and journalists pointing fingers at the Barclays for neglect, but the national attention allowed CEG to step in and grab the building, and it's now been rolled into the huge wider development happening in South Leeds, which has grown out of Tower Works, another example of Holbeck architecture that can transport you halfway around the world. Most excitingly, however, is the recent news from March of this year. In what I can only describe as the most fitting and wonderful arrangement, one that I feel would be sure to guarantee the building living on forever. It is under consideration to become a planned northern branch of the British Library. What a fitting tribute to an amazing building and the legacy of the amazing person behind it. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Leeds Echoes. If you liked it, let me know, and hopefully there'll be some more soon. In the meantime, stay safe. Take care.